Our next speaker is Ingrid. Ingrid's from the University of Surrey. She's a veterinarian working there, and she's going to tell us about the post-mortem examination service that's being run from that site.
Good afternoon. Thank you for still being here at the last session. Thank you for the introduction, George. I will take you through the post-mortem service that we've set up in the last couple of years in Surrey in response to a tender from DEFRA. But first I want to brag a little bit about our new buildings that we've just met up. This is a picture of our new veterinary pathology centre that's been built, a 12 million building that's been opened quite recently. The new approach that we deliver from that building is part of the Surveillance 2014, which is a government new model for surveillance. So instead of relying on government labs funded and completely run by the government, it's actually taking the surveillance somewhat more into practice. So private veterinary surgeons are now involved in delivering the post-mortem surveillance service, which previously was solely delivered by VAOs from the government labs. So this means that private veterinary surgeons need to be trained extra in pathology, and they will be working not from government labs, but actually from fallen stock sites. So the way we actually do it is completely different from a lab situation. We are running it from a fallen stock site from two reasons. It's because it's a general space where dead animals go to anyway, and it's easy for local vets to actually reach. So the whole philosophy is that when an animal dies, it needs to be disposed of. It goes to a fallen stock site, so that won't be different for a farmer, whether the animal dies without the post-mortem or with, it goes to the fallen stock site anyway. At the fallen stock site, a private veterinary surgeon who's trained by one of our pathologists, or actually our team of pathologists, they get extra training at least 2 to 4 times a year, and they've got access to these pathologists if they need any help during their post-mortems, and they perform locally that post-mortem. I'm from the Netherlands, where it's quite easy to get everything to a central point. For me, it was quite stunning that sometimes carcasses had to come from 10 hours away, so that makes it a bit more appropriate to go into local collection sites. The data from those postmortems needs to go back to the submitting PVS. We've developed a purposely built app for that, from which you can see the screens here. It's called PathPal, and it basically assures that we can work anonymously and quickly through the whole process. So what happens is that our receptionist gets a call from a submitting vet, could be any vet in the UK which falls within our area, and I'll show you that later. They call our service, all their details and the farmer's details get entered into a database that is solely and restricted, so solely accessible and restricted to the University of Surrey. So none of our partners actually get the information, the client information or the vet information. The only information that other people get, so the vets performing the post-mortem, is the actual clinical information they need to actually perform the post-mortem. The carcass then goes to the local fallen stock site. That's between the farmer and the fallen stock site. They have contacts anyway. Their trucks are out on the road every day, so that just goes with the normal collection. They get brought back to the fallen stock site, at which point the vet that we work with will then do the post-mortem. The post-mortem results get entered into the second part of our app and be sent straight back to University of Surrey. At the University of Surrey, there's a quick look over the preliminary report, and then it goes out to the submitting vet. Within 24 hours after the submission, there should be a report in the inbox of an email account that we got. Further testing will be done. Depending on the labs, the turnaround time is anywhere between 3 days and 7 days. Those results get sent to the private veterinary surgeon as well. Then they get compiled in a final report, which goes to the veterinary surgeon and the farmer. So that's pretty much the submission process completely automated. There's no paper unless someone wants to print a report, but for our side, there's no paper involved. So this is the area that we cover from the University of Surrey. So we have 4 fallen stock sites around the country. We have 1 ex-APHA lab that we use in Sutton Bonington, and we have 1 veterinary pathology centre that was the nice picture at the front, which is in Surrey. We cover a range of species, so cows, sheep, pigs, anything that can be farmed, poultry and alpacas, goats, llamas, we will cover. So when we talk about submission rates, we started this last year. So all the dots that now appeared on the map are basically what our submission is. And you can see that the submissions tend to cluster a bit around the fallen stock site. That is because it's the easiest for those farmers to actually reach it. It also has a little bit to do with cattle density, but specifically with travel time, I'd say. So up till now, we had 361 submissions in the last year. The majority, just over half, are cattle. Sheep are catching up with a third, and then the rest of them is pig, poultry, and some that we call the miscellaneous category, which has any other farmed animal. I think we had a couple of deer as well, things like that. You can see in the submission rate that is a new service. We changed quite a lot in the way that people were used to doing these PMs. Before we started this model, the model was that the animal actually got picked up, or you could drop it off at a lab, so these relationships were already there. We're still building relations with our private veterinary surgeons, with our farmers, and you can see that that relation has actually been successful, that relation building, for a bit halfway through last year. That's when the numbers went up. This spring has been a really confirmation that we're on the right track, but still we need to go a lot further in that. Because cattle are half our submissions, you can see that the submission rate actually follows the cattle submission rate. But if we look at sheep, you can see a real seasonal trend there. Once after lambing, we get a lot of abortion investigations in there. So you can see that especially last spring, we got in a lot of sheep. So these are just a bit of the description of the first results. So what we see after the port, so these are VIDA for the ones that are in the UK, VIDA diagnosis, so they're based on the diagnoses that are actually given by the government. So about 24% is in the digestive system and 22% are in reproductive. Some are systemic, so that's the viral diseases. Any metabolic diseases are in systemic, and respiratory is almost 16%. There's still quite a bit of unknown where we do get usually get the organ system, and the second column is all the smaller kind of diagnostics. What we did see is that in the beginning, when we had fewer submissions, we got weirder diagnoses because we got only the very special cases. We're now seeing a bit of a normalized diagnosis pattern emerging now that we get a better representation of the herd. So when vets submit cattle cases, the top 5 clinical signs are found dead. That's sometimes just the only thing that we have to go on. Malaise, which goes from anywhere it's a bit off to a complete description of fevers and everything else. Respiratory diseases, abortions, or just being recumbent. So these are clinical signs that are not really specific. The diagnoses that we then end up with are usually digestive in 25% of cases, or systemic. Respiratory are in about 18% of the cases, so actually less animals present with respiratory signs than we end up diagnosing. And then 17% are in the reproductive areas. When we look at sheep, the top 5 clinical signs is a bit different, with number 1 being abortion, and that has to do with the peak that I showed you earlier, is that in the abortion season, so just after around lambing time, we had a real big peak of cases, which were mostly abortion investigation. The second category, same as with the cattle, is found dead, so no other description of what happened, no clinical signs in the herd or whatever, so we just have nothing to go on from the beginning. Then there's recumbent, wasting, and diarrhea. So it's a little bit a different picture than to cattle. But when we look at the diagnoses that we end up with, it's quite similar to what we end up with the cattle. So digestive and reproductive are the top 2. Only reproductive in sheep are a bit larger than in cattle. Systemic, 17%, and then respiratory diseases. I realize it's very, very top system-like, but I just don't have the time to go into it really on detail. What's really important to note is that we do not always reach a diagnosis. Luckily, in almost 3/4 of cases we do, and in the other quarter where we don't reach a diagnosis, we usually know where it's from, so what kind of organ was the culprit in the death, in the cause of death. So only in 4% we literally have no clue why the animal died. Those 4% usually look a bit like this. Oh, sorry. Like that. It's quite difficult to actually make a diagnosis when you only get half a lamb with no organs in there. We much prefer to have cases like this where you've got 2 full lambs and a placenta to go on, instead of something that's been in a freezer after being in a field a bit too long. So the reasons for diagnosis not reached is usually that there's no abnormalities found, that there's not enough material, or that it's heavily autolyzed like I just showed you. So it's important to have the material. It's also important that we do, to note that we do a full post-mortem on all our carcasses. So even if it comes in for reproductive causes, we will still look at all the organ systems, which leads to a better diagnosis rate. So it's an innovative approach because it's never been done before in England like we do. It's use of fallen stock site that's new. It's no paper, so the complete wireless app that we use. Submission rate is still increasing, and we hope that it will double over the next couple of years. In 3/4 of the cases, we do reach a cause of death, and the data is available. We're building up a database that we'll be using for syndromic surveillance in the future, and that's used for analysis of the national herd at the moment. Oh, and I'd like to thank some people as well. So at the University of Surrey, there's a whole team, the pathology team is wholly involved in this service. We work with West Point farm vets in our fallen stock site, so they're the ones that have been trained, and we are heavily helped by APHA with their expertise on species and the running of a service as well. That was it.
Thanks very much, Ingrid. We've got time for a couple of questions. If you'd like to ask a question, could you step up to the mic? And I'll ask one while we're waiting on somebody stepping up to the mic. Ingrid, just for clarification, I think there are still 5 regional veterinary laboratories run by APHA in the system. And do you know how your pattern of submissions and diagnosis achieved compares to the submissions and diagnoses achieved in those standard laboratories?
Yes. At the moment, we are a bit low on submissions compared to they draw on the relationship that they've built on over years. And what we found is that we really need to build our own relationships with the private vets and the farmers submitting to our service. So we are a bit lower on submission rate than the conventional labs. On diagnosis and diagnosis reach, I think we're in the same level as they are. I don't have the information from our lots historically, so I don't really have that comparison yet. We're still working on getting that information. But yeah, we are interested. That is of interest to us as well, to see if there's changes in that.
Bob Reinberger, Australia. I've been around for a little while, and we did have labs within our own little area, and the monthly report that they gave us was really, really useful. So what was happening was that we would send in samples, and the samples would commonly be reported back to us. Mm-hmm. Sometimes within that area we might have something that happened that we didn't understand and we didn't actually do any work with it. And then when we got the report back at the end of the month, we would say, yeah, right, that was around at the time that we were actually doing our original study. So it was a very, very useful bit of tool. Two other questions. Number one was if you're carrying your animal, the dead animal, back to the lab, I know that in Victoria, for example, we had a problem with anthrax, and it caused more problems when they were carrying the animals around. And number two was, do you use, do you burn your carcasses when you're finished, or do you compost them?
That's wholly dependent on the fallen stock site. So it's basically the regular way of dealing with the carcass, so we don't deviate from what would have happened anyway. In the UK, it is that anthrax needs to be excluded on any cattle carcass that's found dead without any signs before moving it, so that whether that's done, we do try to enforce that within our service so that we don't go and spread it across. Other than that, the dealing with the carcasses is no different than it would be with a normal dead animal that doesn't go for PM. With the only difference that if we do find anything on PM, we will call in APHA as any other vet would do if it's notifiable.
The reason for my question was, if you are going to compost it, I was wondering if you came in afterwards and then checked to see whether there was any bacteria left, because most of our farms now are actually composting their dead animals. We don't do any research on whether or not those animals are, after they've been composted, whether those bacteria or relevant bacteria were still available within the composted material we ended up with. And if you were doing that sort of work, I'd be interested to know whether there was any bacteria left.
No, it's not part of the service.
I'm not aware that that happens at all in our system. There's a question from the back. Can we make the question and answer quite brief? I've got one more down here and then we'll move on. So quick question, a quick answer, please.
Patrick Talty from Ireland. My question is this a commercially viable service, or is it heavily subsidised by the University of Surrey?
At the moment, it's heavily subsidised by DEFRA. So we basically half the price is of the post-mortem is covered by DEFRA, but it will be going commercially in probably a couple of years. That's as short as I can do.
And the final question.
Yeah, Roland Labourne from Germany. One more question. Your fallen stock sites, are they private enterprises? And if yes, how can you convince them to cooperate in the system?
They are private enterprises, and it's in their best interest. They like to have an extra service to offer to their clients. So it binds their own farmers to their own fallen stock side anyway. So they're quite happy to have us on board. There's some even have built dedicated spaces for us to do the post-mortems in, because we do need a level of standard hygiene to do them in.
Thanks very much, Ingrid. Thank you. We'll now move on to the next presentation.